The beginning of an unbreakable bond. Dr. Alana Turner stood outside the operating room door, gathering her breath and her thoughts. A deep, almost meditative calmness swept over her, one she had practiced countless times as a surgeon. But today, the weight of the task before her was unlike anything she had ever encountered. This wasn't just another surgery or another patient. It was Olivia, her little sister, lying on that table. And this wasn't just any surgery. It was her final hope, the lifeline for the person she cherished more than anything in the world. Alana's path to this day had been long and arduous, punctuated by countless sacrifices and endless hours of study. Raised in a neighborhood where ambition was often dampened by the realities of limited opportunities, she had clawed her way forward. She still remembered the moments as a young girl when she'd watch her mother, a single parent, working 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. Alana learned resilience early on, understanding that if she wanted something in this world, she'd have to fight for it. And so she did, with a ferocity and dedication that was nearly unmatched. Her dream of becoming a surgeon was sparked in high school, during a field trip to a medical conference. There, she watched a surgeon speak about his work with such passion that she felt an undeniable pull toward medicine. She wanted to be a part of a world where skill, intellect, and compassion intertwined to save lives. And she wanted to give back to her community, to show young black girls like herself that they could achieve greatness too. With a fire that never wavered, Alana excelled in school, earning scholarships, attending medical school, and eventually securing a prestigious surgical residency. Yet throughout her journey, she faced a level of scrutiny and doubt her peers didn't experience. She learned to steel herself against the subtle, and not so subtle, racial bias within the medical field. Professors who assumed she wasn't capable, colleagues who minimized her achievements, and patients who looked at her with skepticism all shaped her. But Alana had learned to turn these challenges into fuel. Each doubter, each obstacle, only sharpened her resolve. But her life's journey wasn't one of ambition alone. The journey became personal the moment Olivia was born. From the first time Alana held Olivia in her arms, an unbreakable bond formed between them. Alana was 11 years old when her mother brought her tiny sister home, bundled in a pink blanket, her small, delicate features peeking out as she opened her eyes to the world. Alana felt her heart swell with a protective love she had never experienced. As her mother juggled work and caring for a newborn, Alana became Olivia's second mother, taking on duties far beyond her years. From feeding and changing diapers to singing Olivia to sleep, Alana's life transformed around her baby sister's needs, and with each milestone Olivia reached, her first words, her first steps, her first day of school, Alana was there, cheering her on with pride. By the time Alana was in her final year of medical school, Olivia was a bright, cheerful child with boundless energy and a keen curiosity. She loved animals, dreamed of being a veterinarian, and idolized her big sister. Alana cherished their shared moments, like when they'd bake cookies together, their kitchen filled with laughter and the smell of chocolate, or when Olivia would draw pictures of her superhero sister, Alana, in a surgeon's coat with a cape. Then, just as Alana was beginning her residency, Olivia's illness struck. It started with small things: fatigue that wouldn't go away, bruises that took too long to heal, a persistent fever that sent chills down Alana's spine. After a series of tests, Olivia was diagnosed with a rare genetic condition, one that would require extensive, delicate treatments. The news hit Alana like a physical blow. She had spent years studying medicine, dedicating her life to saving others, and now the one person she most wanted to protect was slipping beyond her reach. Determined to find a solution, Alana immersed herself in research, advocating fiercely for her sister, refusing to settle for less than the best care. She worked endless shifts in the hospital, all while keeping a close watch on Olivia's progress, pouring her salary into medical expenses, fighting for Olivia's right to the most advanced treatments. Alana promised her mother and herself that no matter the cost, she would ensure her sister had a fighting chance. For the past 2 years, Alana had navigated this dual life. A surgeon by day and a protective sister by night, oscillating between the precision of the operating room and the emotional turmoil of being a family member desperate for a miracle. Olivia's treatment had been long, grueling, and often felt like 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. But Alana's dedication had made a difference. Through her tireless efforts, her sister's condition had stabilized, and after months of careful planning, the final surgery was now upon them. This operation, if successful, could give Olivia the chance at a full, healthy life. As she stood in the sterile hallway outside the operating room, Alana took in a steadying breath. Her life's purpose had always been about saving lives. But today it was different. Today, it was about the life of the person who meant the world to her. She closed her eyes, envisioning Olivia's future, healthy, happy, living the life that her illness had almost stolen from her. Stepping into the operating room, Alana moved with the precision and focus that had earned her respect from colleagues and admiration from her mentors. Olivia lay on the table, small and fragile, her face framed by the edge of the surgical drape. Her breaths were shallow but steady, and her skin, pale and soft, reminded Alana just how vulnerable she was. Alana gently took her sister's hand, feeling the warmth that passed through the barrier of her surgical gloves, and whispered words of comfort. "Olivia," she murmured, her voice low and soothing. "Remember our promise. You're going to come through this, and then we're going to get that ice cream we talked about. I'm here, right by your side." Olivia's eyes fluttered open, a tired but determined smile gracing her lips. "I trust you, Alana. I know you'll make it all better." With those words, Alana's resolve solidified. She adjusted her mask, focused her gaze, and signaled to her team. This was more than a surgery. It was her vow to Olivia, her love for her sister given form. The team around her, some of whom had worked with Alana for years, knew the weight of this operation. The air was thick with unspoken understanding. They were all part of something deeply personal, something sacred. Alana began the procedure with steady hands and a fierce concentration, every move a testament to her skill and dedication. Her hands became an extension of her heart, each cut and suture meticulously placed with the kind of care only a sister could give. Time faded, her world narrowing down to the tools in her hands, the quiet beep of the monitors, and the fragile life she held in her grasp. Hours passed as Alana worked tirelessly, methodically, drawing on every ounce of her training. Finally, they'd reached the most delicate phase of the operation. This was the moment she had been both anticipating and dreading. Her heart raced, a mixture of hope and trepidation filling her as she took a deep breath, ready to make the final move that would ensure Olivia's recovery. But just as Alana prepared to finish, a loud, forceful noise shattered the serene focus of the operating room. The doors burst open, slamming against the wall, and Alana's head snapped up in shock. 3 police officers stood in the doorway, their faces stern, their postures aggressive. Dr. Alana Turner, a woman who had devoted her life to saving others, a sister on the brink of fulfilling her promise, stared in disbelief as they stepped forward, completely disregarding the operating room's sanctity. She felt her heart stop, her focus slip, and an unfamiliar, horrifying realization took hold. And that was the moment her nightmare began. The day of the surgery. The morning of the surgery had been one of quiet resolve for Dr. Alana Turner. She had awoken at dawn, spending a few silent moments watching the sky lighten from her bedroom window, mentally preparing herself. The hours to come were heavy with hope and tension, each minute a step closer to the surgery that could save her sister's life. She had read Olivia's charts over and over, poring over every detail as if willing herself into the certainty of a successful outcome. Olivia had been uncharacteristically quiet that morning, her large brown eyes gazing up at Alana with a mixture of trust and fear. Alana knelt beside her sister's bed, taking her small hand in her own and offering a comforting smile. "Today is the big day. Live," she whispered, brushing a stray hair from Olivia's forehead. "After this, You'll finally be able to do all the things you've been dreaming about." Olivia managed a small, hopeful smile. "You mean I'll be able to play soccer again? And go camping?" Alana chuckled softly, nodding. "Yes, and I'll be right there with you. We'll do all of those things and more. But first, we have to get through today." The hospital room was quiet except for the hum of machines, which monitored Olivia's vital signs. Alana looked around at the sterile walls and bright fluorescent lights that had become far too familiar to her over the years. To most people, hospitals represented illness and fear, but for Alana, this was home, the place where she transformed fear into healing. Despite the daunting task ahead, Alana knew that she was more prepared for this surgery than any other. She had spent weeks researching the latest techniques, consulting with specialists, and running through every possible scenario with her surgical team. Each step had been meticulously planned to give Olivia the best chance at a full recovery. Alana was confident in her skills and her dedication, but she also knew that in the operating room, anything could happen. And that was a truth that weighed heavily on her. As Alana led Olivia through the hospital corridors to the operating room, she found herself overwhelmed with a mixture of love and fear. The walls were lined with the faces of nurses and doctors, all of whom knew the gravity of the day's surgery. Some offered quiet nods of encouragement, while others couldn't hide the apprehension in their eyes. They had all heard about the case. A skilled surgeon operating on her own sister, a patient who had beaten the odds to reach this critical stage. There was a mutual understanding that today was about more than just another procedure. It was about family, resilience, and hope. As they reached the operating room doors, Olivia hesitated, her tiny hand gripping Alana's tighter. "Will it hurt?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alana knelt down, pulling her sister into a gentle hug, hoping to convey all the warmth and reassurance she could muster. "No, Liv. You won't feel a thing. You'll be asleep, and I'll be right there the whole time, making sure everything goes perfectly." With one last reassuring smile, Alana released her grip and gently guided Olivia onto the operating table. She watched as her sister lay down, eyes still wide with fear, yet trusting her completely. Alana's heart ached with the weight of that trust. She had promised Olivia that everything would be okay. And now it was time to make good on that promise. Once Olivia was asleep, Alana turned her focus to the task at hand. She donned her surgical gown and gloves, her movements practiced and precise. The operating room was her sanctuary, a place where her mind could focus completely, pushing aside the world outside to concentrate on the delicate dance of life and death that played out on the table before her. Today, that focus was sharper than ever. The surgical team moved around her with practiced efficiency. Her longtime colleagues knew how crucial this moment was. They had worked with Alana on countless cases, seeing firsthand her commitment to saving lives. But today, they were operating on her little sister. Each member of the team shared a mutual, unspoken commitment to do everything in their power to help Alana succeed. The surgery began, and Alana's world narrowed to the small, fragile form on the table. Her hands were steady, her mind calm and methodical, as she moved through each step with precision. The hum of machines, the quiet commands exchanged between her and her team, and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor were the only sounds in the room. The hours seemed to melt away as Alana worked, each movement a testament to her years of training, each decision made with the kind of skill and dedication that had earned her respect in the field. She navigated through Olivia's delicate anatomy with the utmost care, guiding her hands with an unbreakable resolve. For Alana, this was not just about skill, it was about love. Every suture, every incision was a promise kept, a testament to the unyielding bond she shared with her sister. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Alana reached the most critical part of the procedure. Her entire focus was now on this one task, the final step that would secure Olivia's chance at a healthy life. She steadied her hands, drawing in a deep breath, her mind completely absorbed in the delicate work. But then, a loud bang echoed through the sterile silence, shattering her concentration. The doors to the operating room flew open with a force that startled everyone in the room. Alana looked up, her heart skipping a beat as 3 police officers stormed in, their faces set in grim determination. She froze, disbelief flashing across her face, as the officers' heavy footsteps broke the sanctity of the operating room. Her first instinct was confusion, her mind struggling to make sense of their intrusion. This was a restricted area. No one but authorized medical staff was allowed here, especially during a live surgery. It was unthinkable. One of the officers, a tall man with a hardened expression, stepped forward, his gaze scanning the room before settling on Alana. "Dr. Alana Turner," he demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. Alana's mind reeled, still focused on the open incision in front of her, yet unable to ignore the intrusion. "I'm in the middle of surgery," she replied, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "This is a critical procedure. Whatever this is, it can wait." The officer's face remained impassive, his tone unyielding. "I'm afraid it can't wait, ma'am. We're here to take you in for questioning. You matched the description of a suspect in a robbery that took place nearby. We need you to come with us immediately." Alana's breath caught in her throat. A robbery. The suspect. It was absurd, surreal. Her focus on Olivia's fragile life seemed to be slipping from her grasp as the weight of the officer's words sank in. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She was a surgeon, in the middle of a critical surgery on her own sister, and yet these officers were standing there, treating her as though she were some common criminal. Her voice was tight with barely contained frustration. "This is my sister. I am the only one qualified to finish this surgery. If I leave now, her life is at serious risk. I beg you, just give me a few more minutes to complete the procedure. Then I'll come with you willingly." The officer's eyes narrowed, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, we're not here to negotiate. You need to come with us now." A surge of anger and fear welled up inside Alana. She glanced down at Olivia's small, vulnerable form, the very image of trust and helplessness. Olivia's life depended on her, and the thought of abandoning her at such a critical moment was unthinkable. She looked up at the officer, pleading now, her voice filled with desperation. "Please, this is a life-or-death situation. My sister's life depends on me finishing this surgery. I'm asking you, no, I'm begging you, to let me complete this." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The officer's gaze remained steely, his expression unyielding. He motioned to his colleagues, and before Alana could react, one of them stepped forward, gripping her arm with a firm, unrelenting hold. The sterile world of the operating room, once a place of healing and safety, was now a battleground where Alana found herself powerless, her voice and her pleas swallowed up by the cold indifference of authority. "Ma'am, you're resisting," the officer said, his tone flat, as though he were commenting on the weather rather than wrenching a surgeon away from her patient. Alana's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse racing with fear and fury. Her mind screamed at the injustice, the absurdity of it all. Her sister lay there, vulnerable, her life hanging in the balance, while these officers treated her as if she were guilty of a crime she hadn't committed. She twisted in their grip, her voice rising in desperation. "Please," she cried out, her voice echoing off the sterile walls, filled with a raw, aching desperation. "If you take me away, my sister could die. Please, I'm the only one who can save her." But her pleas were met with silence. The officer tightened his grip, pulling her back from the operating table as she strained against him, her eyes locked on Olivia's still, fragile form. Every fiber of her being screamed at the injustice, the cruelty of what was happening. She was a doctor, a protector, a sister, and yet, in this moment, she was nothing but a suspect in the eyes of these men. As Alana was dragged from the room, her voice echoed down the hall, desperate, filled with a helplessness she had never known. The operating room, once a place of healing and hope, had been transformed into a place of horror, leaving behind only the haunting image of a little girl, alone on the table, as her sister's pleas faded into silence. A shocking accusation. Alana's mind was spinning, her heart hammering with a frantic desperation as the officer's grip tightened on her arms, hauling her out of the operating room. The sterile, controlled world of the hospital corridors blurred around her, distorted by disbelief and rising panic. Olivia was still on the operating table, alone and vulnerable, in the middle of a critical surgery. Alana had promised she would be there to guide her through this. She had promised she would protect her. And now she was being torn away, with no idea if her sister would survive in her absence. The officers didn't pause, didn't ask her questions, didn't even seem to care that they were interrupting a life-or-death procedure. Their indifference was chilling, a cold, unfeeling reminder that in their eyes, Alana was no longer a surgeon or a sister. She was a suspect. "Please," Alana pleaded, her voice breaking with the weight of her terror. "I'm begging you. This is my sister's surgery. She won't make it if I don't finish. Whatever you think I've done, I'll come with you willingly afterward, but let me complete this. Her life is in my hands." One of the officers, Officer Barnes, a tall, broad-shouldered man with an impassive expression, cast her a cold glance. "Ma'am, we're not here to negotiate," he said, his voice dismissive, almost annoyed. "We have a robbery suspect matching your description, and we're not going to wait around while you finish, whatever it is you're doing." The word struck Alana like a physical blow. A robbery suspect. The accusation was so outlandish, so baseless, that for a moment she was speechless. She could feel her pulse racing, her mind scrambling for understanding. This had to be some kind of mistake, a horrific mix-up. But as she looked up at the hardened faces of the officers, she realized that they were serious. They truly believed that she was involved in some crime. Her voice trembled as she forced herself to speak. "I'm a surgeon. I've been here all morning, preparing for this surgery. I have no idea what you're talking about." But Officer Jenkins, the shorter of the two with a clipped, impatient tone, cut her off. "Spare us the excuses. We know what we're dealing with here. You matched the description perfectly, and we're taking you in for questioning." His eyes narrowed, a flicker of contempt in his gaze. "Doctors think they're above the law. Guess what? You're not." Alana felt her anger flare, hot and fierce, mixed with the agony of helplessness. She wrenched against their hold, her eyes wide with disbelief. "This isn't about me thinking I'm above the law. I'm trying to save my sister's life. Look at my credentials, check my badge. Anything. You'll see that I'm telling the truth." The officers exchanged a glance, one that sent a chill down Alana's spine. They were unmoved, untouched by her pleas. She realized with a sickening clarity that they had already made up their minds. In their eyes, she was guilty until proven innocent, and no amount of logic or reasoning would sway them. "Ma'am," Barnes said, his voice colder than before, "you're only making this harder on yourself. You can come quietly, or we'll have to use force." The walls of the hospital seemed to close in around her, the sterile smell of antiseptic suddenly oppressive, suffocating. The place that had been her sanctuary, her space of healing, was now twisted into a scene of chaos and injustice. Her body trembled with suppressed rage and terror. Her sister, her little Olivia, was lying helpless on the table, in the middle of the surgery that could save her life. And these men were ripping her away as if it meant nothing, as if Olivia's life were just a small, insignificant detail in the larger machinery of law enforcement. Desperation clawed at her throat. She was no longer the composed, controlled surgeon she had trained to be. In this moment, she was only a sister, fighting for the life of her family, driven by a primal, unyielding love. She looked back toward the operating room, her eyes filling with tears. "My sister is just a child," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She's 11 years old. She's been fighting for her life. And if I'm not there..." Her words caught in her throat, strangled by the reality that they wouldn't listen, that they didn't care. Barnes sighed, impatient, and jerked her arm roughly. "We don't have time for this drama," he muttered. "We have a suspect in custody matching the description of an accomplice. Apparently, She's young, too. Seems like a family business, doesn't it? Alana's mind reeled at the implication. They were accusing Olivia of being her accomplice, her sweet, innocent little sister, a child who barely understood the world, let alone the concept of crime. She felt the ground shift beneath her, a disorienting wave of disbelief and horror washing over her. This had to be a nightmare, some twisted, horrific dream that she would wake up from any second. But there was no waking up. The officers' hold on her was real, their cold, unfeeling gazes unwavering. "Listen to me," she said, her voice fierce with defiance. "You have the wrong person. I don't know who you're looking for, but it's not me. And it's certainly not my sister. She's a child. I'm a doctor. This is insane." Jenkins rolled his eyes, a smirk curling at the corners of his mouth. "Save it for the judge," he sneered. "Doctors think they're untouchable, think they can hide behind their degrees. But we're not buying it. We see through you." Alana's hands clenched, her body rigid with the effort to control her rising fury. She was accustomed to being underestimated, to having her credentials questioned, to fighting against the subtle racism that pervaded her field. But this was different. This was a blatant, unabashed disregard for her humanity, her professional integrity, and her family's lives. As they dragged her farther from the operating room, her voice cracked with raw desperation. "Please," she begged, her voice a strangled whisper. "If you have any decency, any humanity left in you, let me go back. My sister's life depends on this surgery." But the officers showed no mercy, no understanding. Jenkins smirked as he tightened his grip, his expression smug, almost amused. "Oh, I'm sure she'll be just fine," he said dismissively. "There are other doctors, aren't there? They'll take care of her. You're not as important as you think you are." Alana's heart dropped. Her mind raced, searching desperately for a way out, a way to convince them to let her go back to Olivia. But there was nothing. No words, no arguments left that could reach these men. The bustling corridors of the hospital stretched out before them, filled with people who watched the scene unfold with shock and horror. Some of her colleagues, people she had worked alongside for years, were standing there, their faces etched with disbelief and helplessness. She could see the horror in their eyes, the unspoken apologies, but none of them dared to intervene. They knew better than to interfere with law enforcement, even in such an outrageous situation. They were bound by the same unyielding bureaucracy that was now tearing her away from her sister. As they neared the hospital exit, Alana made one final desperate plea, her voice hoarse and choked with despair. "You don't understand," she whispered, the weight of her grief overwhelming her. "You're condemning my sister to death." Jenkins paused, his face twisted with disdain. He leaned in close, his voice low and mocking. "Oh, I think we understand perfectly. People like you always think they're above the rules, that they can get away with anything. But not this time." The finality of his words struck her like a punch to the gut. She felt her knees go weak, the weight of hopelessness pressing down on her. For the first time in her life, Alana felt truly, utterly powerless. She had fought so hard, sacrificed so much to protect Olivia, to give her a chance at a life free from suffering. And now, because of the prejudice and blind arrogance of these men, that life was slipping through her fingers. As they reached the doors, Alana looked back one last time, her gaze lingering on the hospital, on the operating room where Olivia lay alone, her future hanging by a thread. She had promised Olivia she would be there, that she would protect her. And now, that promise was slipping away, leaving only a hollow emptiness in its wake. The officers pushed her through the doors, out into the harsh glare of the outside world. The cold air hit her like a slap, a cruel reminder that her life, her family's life, was now in the hands of strangers who saw her as nothing more than a suspect, an inconvenience. As the police car doors closed around her, Alana's mind spiraled into despair. She could still see Olivia's small, trusting face, her eyes wide with hope as Alana had promised to make everything better. She had failed her sister, failed the person she loved more than anything in the world. And now, all she could do was wait, trapped and powerless, as the life she had fought so hard to protect hung in the balance. In the grip of injustice, Dr. Alana Turner sat in the back of the police car, her wrists bound, her heart racing with panic. She could barely breathe, each breath shallow and tight, her mind fixed on one terrible truth. Her sister Olivia was lying alone on an operating table, the surgery unfinished. As the car began to pull away from the hospital, Alana pressed her head back against the seat, a torrent of emotions surging through her. Helplessness, rage, and a visceral terror gnawed at her insides, each thought sharper than the last. Olivia, her little sister, was in critical condition, and every second that passed without Alana by her side chipped away at the hope of her survival. The officers in the front seats were silent, speaking only in terse, clipped phrases as they communicated with the dispatcher. It was as if Alana weren't even there, as if the woman whose life they'd just torn apart didn't exist beyond the walls of that vehicle. She tried to speak, to explain once again that they had the wrong person, that they were making a grave mistake, but her voice came out in a whisper, hollow and choked with grief. "Please, my sister," she began, her voice breaking. The officer in the passenger seat, Officer Jenkins, turned slightly, his face impassive. He gave her a look of pure indifference, one that sent a chill down her spine. It was clear he wasn't interested in anything she had to say. To him, she was a suspect, a criminal, and nothing more. "You'll get your chance to explain yourself at the station," he said, his tone dismissive. "Until then, keep quiet." Alana's stomach twisted. She wanted to scream, to fight, to break free of the binds that held her, but there was nothing she could do. The weight of her helplessness pressed down on her, filling her with a raw, desperate fury. Her mind raced with memories of Olivia, her sweet smile, her quiet bravery, as she endured years of painful treatments, each step a grueling battle. And Alana had been there for all of it, her own life shaped around her sister's needs, her every decision rooted in the desire to give Olivia the best chance at life. The hours, the days, the sacrifices, it all felt like it had been torn apart in one reckless moment. A lifetime of work reduced to ashes by the prejudice and arrogance of men who refused to see her as anything more than a suspect. As the car moved farther from the hospital, Alana felt her desperation morph into a cold, seething anger. How could this be happening? How could they simply storm into her operating room, ignore her credentials, her profession, and her pleas, and rip her away from her sister's side? In what world did that make sense? The words she had once spoken to Olivia came back to her, haunting and bitterly ironic now. "You're going to be okay. Liv. I'll always be there for you, no matter what." She had meant those words. She had promised her sister that she would be there, that she would protect her. But as the miles stretched between her and Olivia, that promise felt hollow, its weight unbearable. She could almost feel her sister's fear, lying alone in that cold, sterile room, wondering where Alana had gone, why her sister wasn't by her side like she had promised. The thought tore at her heart, each imagined moment of Olivia's fear another wound to her own soul. The car jerked to a stop in front of the police station, and Alana's eyes darted to the building, a bleak, gray structure that loomed against the overcast sky. She wanted to resist, to scream that they had the wrong person, but she knew it would be futile. Her fate, her sister's fate, was in the hands of people who couldn't see past their own prejudice. They didn't see a surgeon, a woman who had dedicated her life to saving others. They only saw a threat. The officers opened the door and roughly pulled her from the car, their grip unyielding. Alana stumbled, her body tense with frustration, but she bit back the words she wanted to scream. She was led through the police station, her surroundings a blur of harsh fluorescent lights and muted voices, her mind focused solely on one thing: Olivia. She was far from the hospital, far from the surgery that could save her sister's life, and the minutes were slipping away like sand through her fingers. She was led into a small, windowless interrogation room, her wrists freed from the binds, but her freedom feeling just as out of reach. The cold metal chair scraped against the tile floor as she sat, her hands clenched into fists, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. Minutes passed, then hours, with no word, no explanation. She was left to stew in silence, the walls pressing in on her, each second stretching unbearably as she imagined Olivia alone on that table, the unfinished surgery a shadow over her little sister's life. The thought gnawed at her, eating away at her resolve, her hope crumbling under the weight of her fear. Finally, the door opened and Officer Barnes entered, carrying a thick file. He dropped it on the table with a thud, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Turner," he began, his tone carefully neutral, but with a hint of disdain. "We're here to get to the bottom of this. The sooner you tell us the truth, the sooner we can sort this out." Alana's eyes narrowed, her exhaustion pushed aside by a surge of anger. "The truth," she echoed, her voice sharp. "The truth is that I was in the middle of saving my sister's life when you dragged me out of the operating room on the basis of what? A vague description. A baseless accusation." Barnes's expression didn't change. He merely opened the file, flipping through pages with a methodical calm that only fueled Alana's fury. "We have reports of a robbery at a nearby pharmacy," he said, his voice flat. "You matched the description given by witnesses, a woman of your height, your build, and, as they put it, of similar appearance. That's enough reason for us to bring you in." Alana felt her jaw tighten. "And did these witnesses describe the suspect as a surgeon in the middle of a critical procedure? Did they say anything about me being in a hospital, surrounded by people who could verify my identity?" Barnes shrugged, unimpressed. "Descriptions don't always come with a full resume, Dr. Turner. And as for your alibi, we'll look into that in due time. But for now, I suggest you cooperate." Alana could hardly believe the absurdity of it all. This man, with his cold, detached demeanor, was speaking as though her identity, her career, her very life's work, were merely inconvenient details to be looked into. It was as if every achievement, every sacrifice she had made, had been wiped away in a single brutal moment, reduced to a description on a piece of paper. Her voice was cold as she replied, "My sister is on an operating table, Officer Barnes. She is in critical condition, and I am the only surgeon who knows her case, who has prepared for this surgery. If you have any compassion, any decency, you will let me go back." But Barnes only shook his head, his eyes filled with a detached indifference. "This isn't about compassion, Dr. Turner. It's about the law. You're here because we have reason to believe you were involved in a crime. Whatever personal circumstances you have don't change that." Alana's hands clenched, her nails digging into her palms as she struggled to keep her composure. She had faced prejudice before, had endured the quiet racism that had dogged her steps throughout her career. But this was a level of callousness she had never encountered. To these men, she wasn't a surgeon, a protector, or a sister. She was a suspect, a person of interest, stripped of her humanity and dignity. "Officer Barnes," she said slowly, her voice trembling with barely contained fury, "if my sister dies because of this, her blood is on your hands." Barnes didn't flinch. He merely closed the file, his expression unyielding. "That's not our concern, Dr. Turner. Our concern is ensuring that justice is served." The words echoed in the sterile room, each one a bitter reminder of the twisted irony of her situation. She, a doctor who had dedicated her life to saving others, was now powerless, a prisoner of a system that had turned its back on justice and compassion. And in that moment, as Barnes stood up and walked out, leaving her alone once again, she felt the cold weight of despair settle over her, a darkness that wrapped around her like a shroud. Alana sat in silence, her mind a maelstrom of fear and anger. She had no idea what was happening back at the hospital, no idea if anyone had taken over the surgery, if anyone had stepped in to help Olivia. The thought gnawed at her, each passing second a stab of guilt, of failure. She had promised to protect her sister, had sworn that she would be there for her, and now, because of the cruelty and blindness of a broken system, That promise was slipping away. Time passed in a blur, the minutes stretching into hours. She could feel her hope draining away, replaced by a hollow numbness, a quiet despair that gnawed at her insides. And in that moment, as she sat alone in that cold, empty room, she knew that something had changed within her, something deep and irrevocable. She was no longer just a sister fighting for her family. She was a woman who had seen the darkness of injustice firsthand, who had felt the brutal weight of prejudice and cruelty. And as she sat there, trapped and helpless, she made a silent vow. Whatever happened, she would not let this go unchallenged. She would not let her sister's suffering, her own suffering, be in vain. When she finally left this room, when she finally faced the world again, she would not be the same woman. She would be a fighter, a voice for the countless others who had been silenced, ignored, and abandoned by a system that saw them as nothing more than statistics, descriptions, and suspects. But for now, all she could do was wait, her heart aching with the fear that it was already too late. The system's cold grip. The hours Alana spent in that cold, windowless interrogation room felt like an eternity. Her mind replayed the events of the day over and over. The sharp, cutting details seared into her memory. The sterile operating room where her sister lay, the sudden intrusion of police officers, their implacable expressions as they dismissed her pleas, and the horror that had surged through her as they wrenched her away from Olivia. Her sister's life was hanging by a thread, and all Alana could do was sit here, shackled by prejudice and bureaucracy, powerless to change a single thing. At some point, exhaustion began to creep into her bones, dulling her panic and anger into a numbing despair. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting a sickly, pale glow that made the walls feel like they were closing in on her. The silence in the room was oppressive, amplifying the relentless ticking of the clock that counted down each second her sister was left alone. Her thoughts wavered between desperate hope, that someone would intervene, that somehow Olivia would be okay, and a growing dread that each passing second edged her sister closer to a fate Alana couldn't bear to imagine. The door finally opened, and another officer, different from the ones who had dragged her here, entered. He was an older man, with graying hair and a weary look in his eyes. He took a seat across from her, his gaze briefly flicking over her, as if assessing her, weighing her humanity against the paperwork that likely painted her as nothing more than a suspect. "Dr. Turner," he began, his voice measured but impersonal, "I'm Officer Marshall. I've been assigned to your case, and I need to ask you some questions. The sooner we can get to the bottom of this, the sooner we can resolve it." Alana's eyes narrowed, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "Resolve it?" she echoed, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and fury. "My sister is lying on an operating table, and I was ripped away from her in the middle of her surgery. I've already told your colleagues everything. I am a surgeon. I was in the operating room performing a life-saving procedure on my own sister when those officers burst in and dragged me out like some criminal. This is not some misunderstanding you can just resolve with a few questions." Marshall's face remained impassive, though Alana noticed a flicker of something. Was it doubt? In his eyes. He cleared his throat, glancing at the file in front of him. "Dr. Turner, we had a robbery reported this morning at a pharmacy nearby. The description matched your physical appearance, and our officers acted on that information. We have a duty to follow leads, no matter where they take us. Your lead has cost my sister precious time," she shot back, her voice trembling with restrained rage. "Do you have any idea what happens when a surgery is interrupted like that? When the lead surgeon is ripped away from the patient? You have no idea what you've done." Her fists clenched, nails biting into her palms as she tried to keep herself steady. "If anything happens to her, it's on you. On all of you." Marshall shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly unprepared for the force of her words. But he recovered quickly, leaning forward, his voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. "Dr. Turner, you're here because you're under suspicion. The sooner you cooperate, the sooner we can get to the truth. And once we have the truth, if you're innocent, You'll be free to return to your sister." "Innocent?" she scoffed, unable to hide the bitterness in her voice. "You already treated me as guilty the moment your officers stormed into that operating room. They didn't care about verifying my identity, checking my credentials, or even listening to me. They saw a black woman, and that was enough for them to drag me out in handcuffs without a second thought." Marshall stiffened slightly, his gaze flickering toward the door as if wary of being overheard. He shifted his weight in his chair, his voice lowering. "Look, Dr. Turner, I'm just here to gather information. It's nothing personal." "Nothing personal," Alana repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You have no idea, do you? Every part of this is personal. You may see this as just another case, another file to review, but this is my life. My family's life." She leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "And you've taken that from me, all because I happen to match some vague description. So don't tell me this isn't personal." Marshall was silent for a moment, his gaze averted, as though he couldn't quite bring himself to meet her eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost reluctant. "I understand you're upset, Dr. Turner. And I'm sorry for any distress this situation has caused. But we have to follow procedure." Alana clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "Your procedure has turned me into a suspect, a criminal without a shred of evidence. Your procedure has taken me away from my sister when she needed me most." Her voice dropped, her words laced with a cold, seething fury. "Your procedure isn't justice. It's a weapon." Marshall shifted uncomfortably, as though her words struck too close to a truth he didn't want to confront. "I'm going to be frank with you, Dr. Turner. The sooner you answer our questions, the sooner we can determine if you're involved, and if not, get you released." Alana's jaw tightened. She knew that cooperating might be her only way out, her only chance to return to Olivia, but the injustice of it all burned in her throat. They were treating her as though her years of education, her credentials, her entire career were worth nothing, reduced to a profile, a set of assumptions, and a police report. To them, she was a body that fit a description, and they didn't care to know any more than that. Taking a steadying breath, she forced herself to answer their questions, her responses clipped and precise. She recounted her schedule, her work that day, the preparations she'd made for Olivia's surgery. She described every moment in meticulous detail, painting a picture of the life she led, the sacrifices she'd made, the responsibilities she carried. And with each answer, she felt a piece of herself stripped away. Her identity reduced to facts and details, her humanity diminished to satisfy the cold clinical requirements of their investigation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Marshall closed the file, nodding. "Thank you, Dr. Turner. We'll verify this information. If everything checks out, you'll be free to go." Alana's heart ached, her voice barely a whisper. "And what about my sister? Will you verify that as well? Will you see if she's still alive?" Marshall's gaze flickered, a hint of discomfort crossing his face. He didn't answer directly, but Alana could tell from his silence that he had no intention of looking into Olivia's condition. To them, Olivia was a footnote, a complication in an otherwise straightforward case, and that realization hit her with a brutal finality. She was nothing more than a file, a statistic, an inconvenience in their neatly ordered world. The hours passed slowly, each minute dragging on, a hollow ache settling in Alana's chest. She knew that with every second that passed, Olivia's chances of survival grew slimmer. She had spent years studying, preparing, dedicating her life to saving others, and now, when her skills were needed most, she was powerless, trapped by a system that saw her as nothing more than a suspect. As the door finally opened, Officer Barnes stepped in, his face as expressionless as ever. "Dr. Turner," he said, his voice clipped, "you're free to go. We've verified your alibi, and it appears you were, in fact, in the hospital at the time of the robbery." The words felt like a slap in the face. "Appears?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. You tore me away from my sister's surgery, put her life at risk. And now you say it appears I was innocent." Barnes shrugged, unaffected. "Just following procedure, ma'am. You're free to go." Alana stood, her body tense with barely contained rage. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make them understand the depth of what they'd done. But she knew it would be useless. These men, this system, they didn't care. She was nothing to them, a name on a file, a suspect who happened to be cleared. And in their eyes, that was enough. As she was escorted out of the police station, the world around her felt muted, distorted. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, each beat a reminder of the life she had been torn away from, the sister she had left behind. The hospital loomed ahead, and Alana's steps quickened, her mind racing with fear, with hope, with a desperate need to see Olivia again. She burst through the hospital doors, ignoring the stares, the murmurs of her colleagues, her only thought on her sister. The corridors seemed endless, each step a torment as she made her way back to the operating room. Her heart pounded as she rounded the corner, finally reaching the doors. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as she looked inside. Olivia lay on the bed, pale and still, her small body hooked up to machines that beat softly, their rhythms a haunting reminder of the life that had nearly slipped away. Alana felt her knees go weak, a sob escaping her as she approached her sister's side. A nurse appeared at her elbow, her expression sympathetic but hesitant. "Dr. Turner." Olivia's condition stabilized, but it was touch and go for a while. "We were able to call in another surgeon to complete the operation, but it was close." Alana barely heard her gaze fixed on Olivia's face, her sister's features pale and fragile. She reached out, her hand trembling as she brushed a stray strand of hair from Olivia's forehead. The guilt, the rage, the helplessness she had felt in that interrogation room surged back, filling her with a fierce, unyielding determination. This wasn't over. She would not let her sister's suffering, her own suffering, be reduced to a mere inconvenience in a system that had failed her. She would fight, not just for Olivia, but for every person who had been silenced, ignored, and dehumanized. Because this wasn't just her story, it was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, the resilience of those who refuse to be broken by injustice. And as Alana sat by her sister's side, her heart filled with a quiet, unbreakable resolve, she knew that she would do whatever it took to make sure no one else had to endure what she had. Aftermath and awakening. In the days that followed, Alana struggled to process the whirlwind of events that had upended her life. She spent every waking moment by Olivia's side, keeping watch over her sister as she slowly recovered. The bruises on her sister's fragile arms, a byproduct of her illness, and the disrupted surgery, felt like accusations against the injustice they had endured. Every time Alana looked at Olivia, she was reminded of the cold faces of the officers, their hardened expressions dismissing her pleas, their brutal indifference to the life she had fought so hard to save. Though Olivia was alive, the ordeal had left scars deeper than any wound. Alana's faith in the systems meant to protect them, to serve justice, was shattered, replaced by a simmering rage that pulsed beneath her calm exterior. She knew she could not simply return to her life as before, as though nothing had happened. There was too much at stake, not only for herself, but for every other person who had been judged, mistreated, and dismissed by those who saw them as less than human. But as Olivia's health stabilized and her own strength returned, Alana made a decision. She could either let this pain consume her, or she could channel it into something greater, something that might prevent this nightmare from happening to anyone else. For too long, she had put her head down, focused on her work, and tried to rise above the prejudices she encountered. But now, she realized that her silence was no longer an option. She had to act. The first step was filing an official complaint against the officers involved, detailing every moment of the injustice she and her sister had endured. Alana reached out to an attorney, a prominent advocate for civil rights, who listened to her story with a compassion she hadn't encountered in those endless hours at the police station. The attorney, A woman named Evelyn Marks assured her that her voice would not go unheard, that she would have the support of people who would not rest until justice was served. "It's more than just a legal case, Dr. Turner," Evelyn said, her voice steady but resolute. "This is about accountability. These officers acted out of prejudice and ignorance, and they need to be held responsible for the pain they caused. And the system that enabled them needs to be challenged." Alana nodded, a feeling of solidarity rising within her. She had spent so long fighting alone, but now, for the first time, she felt as though she was part of something larger, a movement that went beyond her own personal trauma. This was a fight for her sister, for every patient she'd ever treated, and for every person who had ever been silenced by injustice. Over the next few weeks, her story began to gain traction. News outlets picked up the story, focusing on the horrifying moment that a surgeon, a woman dedicated to saving lives, was forcibly removed from her own sister's surgery by police officers acting on nothing more than racial bias and a flimsy description. Alana's story struck a nerve, igniting public outrage and a call for change. People were shocked not only by the absurdity of her situation, but by the sheer cruelty and disregard for human life displayed by those who were supposed to protect it. As the story spread, Alana received an outpouring of support from colleagues, community leaders, civil rights activists, and people from all walks of life who had experienced similar encounters with prejudice and systemic injustice. Letters poured in, people sharing their own stories, their own pain, their own anger, each message reinforcing Alana's resolve. She realized that her voice, once silenced in that interrogation room, was now amplified by thousands who saw in her story their own struggle, their own fight for dignity and justice. But not everyone supported her. Alana also faced backlash from those who saw her as a troublemaker, someone who was stirring up unnecessary issues. Online commentators questioned her version of events, accusing her of exaggerating, of trying to gain sympathy. Some even suggested that she should have complied quietly, that her sister's life was ultimately her responsibility and not the police's concern. The sting of these words was sharp, a reminder that there would always be those who refused to acknowledge the reality of injustice, who preferred to keep their blinders on, ignorant to the suffering of others. Yet, for every negative comment, there were dozens more standing in solidarity, their voices lifting her up. Alana's commitment to her cause grew with each story shared, each letter received. She became a symbol, a face for those who had been disregarded and dehumanized. Her voice joined a larger conversation, one that demanded accountability from a system that all too often failed the very people it claimed to serve. Determined to make a difference beyond her individual case, Alana launched a campaign focused on advocating for reform within law enforcement. She pushed for mandatory training in bias recognition, the implementation of independent oversight committees, and a restructuring of protocols to ensure that cases involving medical personnel were handled with sensitivity and caution. With Evelyn's help, she rallied healthcare professionals, civil rights organizations, and legal experts to join her in this mission, their combined voices creating a wave of pressure that the local government could no longer ignore. Alana's efforts soon reached the attention of national organizations, and she was invited to speak at conferences, community gatherings, and public forums. Each time she took the stage, she recounted her story with a quiet dignity, her words resonating with audiences who saw in her the strength and resilience they aspired to embody. She spoke not only of her own pain, but of the countless others who had suffered in silence, her voice rising as a testament to the power of resistance, to the importance of speaking out against injustice. Her activism became a part of her life, a second career that she pursued alongside her work as a surgeon. In the hospital, she was still Dr. Turner, the dedicated, compassionate physician who fought for her patients' lives. But outside those walls, she had become an advocate, a symbol of hope for those who had felt powerless in the face of systemic oppression. Meanwhile, Olivia's recovery progressed, each day a small miracle that reminded Alana of what she had fought so hard to protect. Her sister, once fragile and vulnerable, regained her strength, her resilience a mirror of Alana's own. Alana was by her side through every step of her healing, the bond between them stronger than ever, forged anew in the fires of their shared ordeal. Months passed, and the case against the police officers responsible for Alana's arrest finally went to court. Alana and her legal team presented their evidence with unflinching resolve, recounting the events of that terrible day with precision and clarity. The courtroom was filled with supporters, people who had followed her story, people who believed in her fight, people who saw in her a representation of their own battles against injustice. The officers tried to defend their actions, citing procedure and public safety as justifications for their actions. But as Alana's story unfolded, as her colleagues and witnesses testified to her character and her professionalism, it became clear that the officers' actions had been fueled not by a commitment to justice, but by prejudice and ignorance. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom was silent, tense with anticipation. The judge ruled in Alana's favor, stating that the officers had acted with reckless disregard for human life, and that their actions had caused immeasurable harm to a family and a community. The officers were held accountable, ordered to undergo training and placed under strict oversight. It was a small victory, a single step in a much larger battle, but it was a validation of Alana's fight, a reminder that change was possible, even if it came one case at a time. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of relief and grief, a strange, bittersweet combination that left Alana feeling both triumphant and weary. She knew that her fight was far from over, that there were still countless others facing the same injustices she had endured. But she also knew that she had made a difference, that her voice had resonated, that her story had sparked a movement. As she sat beside Olivia, watching her sister smile and laugh once more, Alana felt a profound sense of purpose settle within her. This was her path now, not only to save lives in the operating room, but to fight for the dignity and humanity of every person, to ensure that no one else had to endure the nightmare she and her sister had faced. In the end, Alana's story was not just about one woman's struggle against a system that had failed her. It was a testament to the power of resilience, to the strength of a voice that refused to be silenced, to the unbreakable bond of love that had carried her through even the darkest moments. She knew there would be more battles ahead, more fights to wage, but she was ready. Because now she was not just a surgeon, not just a sister, but a warrior for justice, a champion for those who could not fight for themselves. And in the quiet strength of that resolve, Alana found a new sense of peace, a purpose that transcended her own pain, a legacy that would live on long after the scars of that day had faded.